Welcome, students. This week, we are going to talk more about the Nemeth code switch indicators, the single word switch indicator, as well as the use of individual letters as variables in the Nemeth code. Before we get too far into that, I want to take just a moment to review how ordinal numbers are written in Braille. Ordinal numbers do not use a contraction with them, ever. They don't do it in UEB, so you couldn't write first with an ST contraction. And there's a good reason for that. It would just be a fraction line. So we'll actually Braille out the ST when we're writing first. We'll Braille out the TH in UEB anytime you're writing fourth. In Nemeth, the same is true. If you're writing fourth, you'll Braille out the TH after it. If you're writing first, you would still Braille out the ST after it. Don't try and use contractions for any ordinal number because those symbols have other meanings in math. So that's just kind of an across-the-board reminder. Next, we'll talk a little about switching into Nemeth. So of course, anytime you are writing in the Nemeth code, you do want to switch in, and when you're done writing in Nemeth or you're done with the equation, switch out of it. Inside your Nemeth code switch indicators, there should be no contractions. This is now the provisional guidance as BANA is figuring out all of the implications of the switch indicators it created. As a Nemeth user myself from the way back days where some contractions were allowed, some of the times in some places, the whole no contractions inside Nemeth confuses me a little bit. I recognize though that it will also make life much more straightforward. It's not quite the same as, I'm always used to, but I'm learning it right beside you and we're going to get there. So the Nemeth switch indicators, when you switch into Nemeth, you now cannot use any contractions for group signs or words inside Nemeth. They haven't quite made this initial Nemeth switch indicator quite as strong yet as to just set grade 1 mode throughout. So you will still see reasons why you would need to use that even inside Nemeth. But it also looks like BANA is still figuring out kind of what all of the trickle-down effects are of having turn on, turn off Nemeth mode and how that's going to change or revise Nemeth to make it smooth and consistent. But at the very least, don't read or write strong group signs or strong word signs, lower group signs or lower word signs, initial or final letter contractions, or short form words inside a Nemeth passage and expect them to have their group sign meaning. That's not going to be allowed. So go ahead and spell things out when you're writing in Nemeth mode. The only time then that you could use contractions inside Nemeth mode is if you switch back to UEB with a terminator. So after a terminator like this, then I could go ahead and write contractions and that would be fine. Or if you use a single word switch indicator, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. In previous units, we started the discussion about numbers standing alone and whether or not you need to switch to Nemeth for them. We've been talking about signs of operation, signs of comparison as a solid indicator that something is mathy or sciencey enough to necessitate Nemeth code. If you're doing math, you want to do it in the math code. In your homework, you may start to see some examples, or in your textbook, some examples where they do that for decimals as well. And I think the thinking here is that if it needs to be so precise as to call for a decimal, then perhaps you want to take that as an indicator that it's so precise that it's mathy or sciencey, or you're going to do a mathy thing with that number or a sciencey thing with that number. At the very least, your book is showing you how you would switch those into Nemeth if you chose to, and giving you the practice, maybe like you would give practice to young kids who are learning to read and write the Nemeth decimal point. So I can imagine, and it's going to contrive some excuses to put those in Nemeth. We also could debate that a number that has a decimal in it is still standing alone, that a decimal is not in operation. Multiple right ways to Braille something, because you can Braille that correctly in UEB. Of course, you can Braille all of math correctly in UEB using UEB technical rules, but if you're teaching Nemeth so that you'll have the efficiency of Nemeth at higher math levels, sometimes you have to introduce that early, and you take the practice that you can get in the general curriculum. And that's the way I like to think about the decimal points and why they're being switched to Nemeth, is that you're just creating practice opportunities when a child is young or in isolation before more complex math comes along, so that they'll already know the code when the math gets more complex. If you're in a Nemeth passage, and commas or semicolons are done in math when they follow numbers, even if you can logically see them as being commas that are related to the sentence, the rules are allowing you to put commas after numbers as math commas, which just makes for ease of writing. You don't have that kind of interrupter of terminating or putting a punctuation indicator, which is easy. Your book may also show you this week some word cases where you'd use a UEB comma following the rule. And on this, my longtime Nemeth reading brain is very confused. I would have thought you would need a punctuation indicator there, but again, it's the new rules for the switch indicators. So in this context that they're going to show you, they're using it in part of a set, where they're using the set, the curly braces, to show that something is a set, and then what's in the set is written out in words. And so the comma at the end of the word, they're thinking, hey, that would make tons of sense that that's just a comma, so you can just write a regular .2 comma there. And again, I get that you would switch to Nemeth to show the curly braces in Nemeth, and a teacher teaching set theory may very well use the students in the class to demonstrate the set with their regular names. Historically, we would have needed a punctuation indicator there. It looks like they're making the case that you don't in this one case. And that brings to light sort of the pragmatist matter, that there are multiple right ways to transcribe things, given that the transcriber can choose to either enter Nemeth or not to enter Nemeth, or at what point to enter Nemeth, and switch codes to represent some things in Nemeth and some things in UEB. With that set theory example, you could also make the case that you would just write that in UEB, and that would be fine. You could also make the case that you need a punctuation indicator in there so that it doesn't look like the one at the end of a chemistry word. But we don't generally put chemistry in sets, so it's all kind of contrived anyway. So I would say for the purpose of class, keep in mind that we are making examples to try and get at the whole diversity of all of the many things that Nemeth and Braille can represent, and that because there are multiple right ways to do it, you and I might sometimes choose a different logical way, and that's not the end of the world. It's as long as it's logical and readable and not confusable for something else in math, that's okay. If I get a little stuck on the old rules and look at you and say, hey, it shouldn't be that, it should be this other thing, feel free to come back to me and say, no, but look right here in the book, I'm following this example and this rule, and it can be this way, because the reality is I might get it wrong too, and I would be happy to have a larger discussion from you. As long as you are following a cogent set of rules, right, and you're doing it consistently, and it's logical, then it's fine that there's more than one right way. And in the actual world of transcription, this is actually dealt with by that, the kind of superseding rule is be consistent in your document. From the start of your document to the end of your document, don't do the same thing two different ways. But if you're internally consistent, your Braille reader can look at the transcriber page at the front where special symbols are given and go ahead and deal with that. They can understand what the context is that they're reading in this document and use it, and that's okay. So I'm always happy to know you're thinking, though, we can have bigger conversations about the nuances of some of these switch indicator rules as you go. Look at your textbook closely. It'll match the examples on your homework, so I think you'll have no trouble applying each example. But if we come up with different ways, we can cope with that too. With that this week, you will also get to learn the single word switch indicator. And that's used when we have multiple math problems with a word dividing them. So I might have something that says is it, and then I switch into Nemeth and say 3 plus 5, and then I want to say or 5 plus 3. Or 5 plus 3, and then terminate my Nemeth and finish my sentence. I have this problem in the middle that this word or is not the math word or. It's not the or of an and, or, nor logic set. It's just the or of is it this or that. That or belongs to the sentence, not to the math. So how do we deal with that in Nemeth in UEB contexts? One choice would be to terminate Nemeth mode before it, write or, which is not part of the math, and then restart Nemeth mode. The other choice is to use a single word switch indicator, which says the next one word is not part of the Nemeth. It's a dot 3 and then a dot 6. And it goes right before the word, and there's no spacing. I've got that not feeling correct on my Braille display. I'm going to correct it. It's a dot 6 and then a dot 3. So it's the same as a capital terminator would be in UEB as our switch indicator for Nemeth. So it's just switching us out of Nemeth for one word. Again, that's a dot 6 and then a dot 3 right before the word. Just like a capital indicator, it comes right before the word. You can't put a space after it. As soon as you do put a space, that terminates our switch. So this is used anytime there's a contraction. It's also used anytime the word just doesn't belong to the math. In this example, there is no contraction there. I could make the same basic question and simply give this an and, if it were an and instead of an or. Is it 3 plus 5 and 5 plus 3? Then when I use my switch indicator, it switches me into UEB for exactly one word. And because I'm in UEB, I can use contractions while I'm in that UEB mode for one word. So the switch indicator is handy in being a contraction and letting you see it the way it's normally seen in UEB instead of it being spelled out AND. AND would take the same amount of space as the switch indicator and the AND contraction, but then you have the disadvantage of it looking like the and is part of the math and not part of the sentence. So it does two things. It lets us use contractions and it makes clear that it's not a word in the math. Your book is going to use some examples that include some examples of, and we could debate that a little bit. We'll disclose here that my mother is a mathematician, and one of her prevailing arguments in life is that certain English words have a mathematical meaning that you cannot get away from. So one of the examples is that of always means multiply. It always means to multiply. But if you get two mathematicians in the room and they don't both share that opinion, you can get a really interesting argument. You could make a flat-out party game out of it if you wanted, of whether or not some of these words have a meaning other than their math meaning, and whether you can ever take the math out of the word, so to speak. So if you take your word out of the math in this case, you've made clear that you believe it's part of the sentence. If another transcriber left some of those words in the math, could understand how they would think that that word is part of the math, and that's a valid stance too. But if it's part of the math, if it's in the Nemeth context, because we've got these Nemeth switch indicators that mean no contractions inside, if you're saying it's really and like an and set in logic, and I'm using it as the mathematical operation and, then you have to spell it out. You can't use contractions in that space in that way. Because again, the contraction for and has a totally different math symbol meaning in Nemeth, and it would be confused for the wrong thing. So spell it out or switch out of Nemeth into UEB so that you can use it in UEB. One of the other things that's been clarified in this is that they're now allowing the switch indicator only for one word. And if there were 2 words there, you would need to just terminate Nemeth, say the 2 words, and then restart Nemeth, rather than string together multiple switch indicators. So be aware of that. All right, with that underway, let's talk a little about letters in math. As we get into the higher bits of math, upper elementary school into middle school, we get into the time and space where we start using variables. And variables are really math, right? Until then, you're just doing arithmetic. But once you have variables, you can start to solve some actual math. If they stand alone in a narrative, you can leave it in UEB, just like you would a number that was standing alone. If there's a single letter, if the instructions tell you to do something like find the value of X, you can still leave it standing alone. But if there were 2 or more variables connected together, then we would want to see that written in Nemeth. So if instead it asked you to find the value of angle and then gave an angle name like WX, right? So, there's the top point and then the next point are the two sides that connected there. Then you would go ahead and put that angle name in Nemeth. If it were the angle symbol, the symbol would go into the Nemeth code with it as well. Do remember when you're writing variables standing alone in UEB, most of them require a grade 1 indicator. The grade 1 indicator is dots 5, 6. And that's true on the 23 letters that have an alphabetic word sign meaning. So that but, can, do list, right? Everything except for A, I, and O. Everything else has a word that it could mean in a UEB passage. If you want to use the variable there, you'll need the grade 1 indicator or the dot 5, 6 directly in front of it. In Nemeth, that indicator has a friend that we call the English language indicator. And the English language indicator is conveniently also dots 5, 6. They work similarly, a little bit of nuance difference to how they end and when they end and where, a little bit of nuance, but generally it works like a grade 1 indicator. Our English language indicator tells you that the next thing written here in a Nemeth equation is an English letter. It has a friend in Nemeth called the Greek letter indicator, which I'm sure you can imagine has its own super handy moments in higher math and in physics. So the rule sets in Nemeth relate to the way that we use all of these in math, and the rule sets in UEB are specific to how we use them in UEB. But conveniently, 5, 6 still just means the next thing's a regular normal letter. The order of indicators is the same as well. So if you had a capital variable, you would do a dot 5, 6 and then the dot 6 if there was one, and then the letter. So if I needed to write the variable capital X, I could go ahead and braille that capital X. Whether I was in Nemeth or in UEB, it would be the same. So that one's not too tricky to remember. English letter indicators, however, are not needed in Nemeth mode next to a sign of comparison. Those signs of comparison are your equal sign, your greater than, your less than, your ratios, your proportions, right? Things that compare one side of the balance to the other side of the balance. And do remember that a space is kind of part of that comparison point. So if the variable is right before the space that's right before the equal sign or right after the space that's right after the equal sign, you do not need an English letter indicator there, because somebody is not going to confuse 12 equals X for 12 equals it. Just it being next to an equal sign makes it obvious that a variable would be the thing that would happen there. So you don't need to use it there. And you also won't need to use an English letter indicator anytime the variable is unspaced from other signs in math. So if I write 2x I don't need an English letter indicator there for a whole plethora of reasons, right? It's being multiplied by the 2, so I know it's an X and not an it because I can't multiply it by 2. It's after a numeric indicator, which sets grade 1 mode through the rest of the line, so it can't be an it because it's also been put into an actual grade 1 mode. Less obvious examples are things like X plus 3, right, where there is no numeric indicator setting grade 1 mode, but just because the X is next to a sign of operation, it can't be an it because it's not standing alone, right? Now it's with things. It's got friends. It's not an alphabetic word sign there because it's not alone. So no English language indicator needed when you're in a bigger equation. Look at your chapter closely. Let me know if you think the rule is use an English letter indicator for variables and the exception is all the places that you don't need it, or if you think it would be better to say letters obviously are variables in math with the exception of when they're standing totally alone, not near anything else, including not near a sign of operation, then use an English language indicator. I think we could have an interesting set of opinions on which one's the rule and which one's the exception in this case. Love to hear your thoughts. One thing I will clarify, or I guess highlight, is when you're labeling options in Nemeth, right? So if you've got problem 1, and then you're in Nemeth mode, and it asks you 3x equals 9. And then starts to give you options like x equals 2, option B, x equals, oops, an extra symbol in there, 3, option C, x equals 4, right? Like, what does x equal? Here are some choices that when we're doing this kind of enumerated list where it's letter A, letter B, letter C, the rules of Nemeth are super clear. You always use the English letter indicator in that list. In Nemeth, we don't do the whole, but not if it's an A, I, or O thing. We just do it to all the letters. Because it shows this is an English letter A. It's not the word A. We also use the punctuation indicator in Nemeth. So super clear. It makes our choice A, B, C, or D long, but it makes them all the same length. And that's really useful because now look, all my X's are lined up, all my equals are lined up, and all my choices that change are lined up. So it's really easy as a Braille reader to skim and find the one I want and then look at what the choice was because I can kind of ignore those choices on the left until I've chosen and read it back. When you're teaching your kids and they start getting good at Braille scanning and they scan through the 2, 3, and 4 and they choose that it's 3, make sure to prompt them at some point to read the whole line before they settle on it, just in case somebody did something sneaky like do a y equals 3 and then d x equals 3. You know that thing you teach kids about read the whole answer and read all the choices and make sure it's right. That still applies. That still applies to blind kids. Make sure they know that. But it is handy to not have to read through each of the letter choices when you're searching for an answer because anything that gives us an iota more efficiency in Braille helps us a little bit to keep up with all the sighted people who can see the whole thing at once. So that same length prefix, really handy to pay attention to what's relevant and then only use the parts of the prefix you need. So there's my fun little soapbox on why I think it's cool that in Nemeth we use a English letter indicator in front of even the letters A, I, and O when we're giving choices in a list, when in UEB you would not do that. So it's a little bit different. All right. I hope that gives you some of the highlights to hang your hat on this week. Make sure you look at the examples in your book in detail. Speak up if you have any questions. And I hope you'll find that they're very closely tied to the homework that you're working on this week. Happy Brailing!